In this episode, I have a fun and feisty chat with Natasha Carter about her first novel, Unfinished Business. Natasha lives in the Midwest with her family and two cats. She loves nature, astrology, tarot, and all things spiritual or esoteric. Natasha says she knew she wanted to be a writer way back when she learned to read, but not until 2019 did she go all in. She started a blog and then says that writing Unfinished Business was an accident. Now she's got many works in progress. In addition to erotic romance, Natasha writes mystery, suspense, and science fiction. I'm so glad Natasha crossed my path. Here's our story. It was a year ago when I decided to dive into Twitter. I had about 55 followers, and I ended up immediately finding the most awesome community of writers and creators of all sorts. I was intrigued by the constant flow of amusing, inspiring, truthful, and self reflective tweets by this woman who occasionally posted an inviting but playful picture of her biting her full red lips and offering a tiny peek at her cleavage. I was hooked. And when I checked out her profile and saw she had 122,000 followers, now she's at over 150,000, I told myself, this woman knows what she's doing. I need her. For 4 months, I paid Natasha to teach me, and she graciously shared my tweets with her network. She helped me grow to more than 4,000 followers, and then I took it over and found my groove. I wanted to stay connected to Natasha, this millennial woman, mother, wife, fellow writer who was about 2 decades behind me in age. She intrigued me. We share a passion for writing about romance and sex, but we have different experiences and different perspectives. So much has changed since I was her age, and yet so much hasn't changed. And there's also been regression when it comes to women and attitudes about women. But we are on the cusp of another jump in human consciousness, I'm convinced, as all sorts of conventions and systems break down, including forcing people into boxes of gender, sexuality, and relationship arrangements. Natasha's erotic romance novel reflects these changes. What Natasha and I have in common is we're both feisty and rebellious. In a way, Natasha's more rebellious than I am. She's more obnoxious in a good way. And at the same time, her posts reveal her vulnerability. But she learned earlier than me not to hide her vulnerability. In fact, it's likely what attracts people to her, like a siren song. She's a fighter in public, where I'm not really unless it's on behalf of others. Anyway, I know you're going to love our conversation, and for sure, you'll want to buy her novel, whether you're into erotic romance or not. So let's get started. Welcome, Natasha.
Hi.
Hi. Hey, so let's start by having you just tell us what's going on in your life and how are book sales going? And you're a self-publisher like me. So has that experience, sort of come out the way that you thought it would be? And then also, if there's anything you want to add about just sort of how you and I met and how we've stayed in touch, maybe you have funny Twitter story about me or whatever. So what's going on in your life right now?
Well, I'm actually working full time again in social services. So I'm busy. I have two kids too. So I've been kind of a little, I haven't been writing as much, which has been hard for me
Yeah.
because my passion, my joy. But as a self-published indie author, we don't get the luxury of being full-time authors most of the time. So uh, the experience has been great, honestly. Like I originally, when I first published, I sold way more books than I imagined I would just as an indie author right
Yay.
away. So, and book sales have slowed a bit, and that's to be expected. Um, I feel like I'm just going to keep building and building with each book. I'm planning on publishing my next one next month, hopefully. It's with my editor right now. I sent it over last night, even though I know it's not ready, because I was like, I just need some insight from you. So we'll see how it shapes up, and hopefully I can get it out next month like I planned. And that's actually the first book in a series.
That's fantastic. And that's fast. And what you're learning is that now from now on, every day you'll just be finding opportunities to tell people about your book and intrigue them, and hopefully they go buy it. It's like part of your daily life now.
Yeah.
So, okay, so let's dig in. Um, this is funny. I hadn't heard of the term slow burn romance until I met my other millennial writer friend. Her name is J.D. Edwin, and she's written two fantastic fantasy novels. One is called Headspace, and the other one is called Master of the Arena. And I guess that's how I write, though. So your book, Unfinished Business, is not slow burn. It's probably the opposite of slow burn. It's quite literal, boldly describing sex scenes and being quite direct about lessons that, you're learning along the way. So I enjoyed reading it, and it did keep my attention. Most importantly, I didn't know how it was going to end. So for me, that's like the mark of a good story. So why don't we start with how the story came about? Because you say it was an accident.
It definitely was. Like, I planned on writing a book, but I did not plan on writing this book. So, um, actually, it was another. I had before this is my first foray into fiction, really. Before this, I was just mostly doing blog writing and kind of like personal essay type stuff on Elephant Journal and poetry, but I hadn't dabbled into fiction yet. And another author friend of mine who wrote erotica challenged me to a exercise and was like, just give it a go, just see how it goes, just write a short story. And I was like, okay. And at first I was like, no, I can't write that, no, but fuck it, I'll just try it. So I started writing it, and it just kept going. The story just kept going, and it was really fun to write, and it was really natural. It was the most natural writing I've ever done because it just flowed. Like, I think it took me maybe 7 or 8 months to finish that first draft of this, which is wild.
That's fantastic. I think it also speaks to the fact that, you know, sometimes we think we know why we wrote something, but our unconscious has an agenda all its own. So it's like your friend was the inciting incident in this story of your story coming about because you're like, I don't know. Okay, you dared me. And of course you were going to take her up on that dare. That's who you are.
Actually, this man too.
Oh my gosh, I really like it. That makes it even sweeter. So, okay. Let's talk about the main characters. So there's Robert, the first mysterious attraction. There's Tristan, the next mysterious attraction that shows up just in time to disrupt the repetition of what you could call an unconscious codependent situation. And then there's Carissa, our protagonist. And as a depth psychologist, I'm really not capable of experiencing anything except through a depth psychology lens. So I'm always interested in what is going on beneath the surface. And as I read your novel, I experienced Robert and Tristan as characters in the protagonist's inner world, in your inner world. And I loved how your narration and inner dialogue hinted at the semi-awareness of it, right? So it was interesting because a lot of novels wouldn't be able to effectively work in the kind of semi-conscious awareness without like full on analyzing it and telling people the moral of the story. So I thought that was really good. So my question to you is, what do you want my listeners to know about your characters and without, spilling the beans? And how did you even come up with them? Are they based in real life experience or, yours or other people's? And your novel is fiction, but of course, the foundation of fiction is real life, whether it's yours or someone else's. So, and of course, these stories, because you didn't really choose to write this novel, you were sort of inspired or instigated to write it. There is like an unconscious agenda at work at working out something. And I do, as I said in my intro, I do see you weaving in these really real dynamics that are happening in the world, and you didn't plan it. And it's really interesting how it just flowed out of you. It's like you were really open to being a vessel for creative intelligence to flow through you, and you didn't fight it. You surrendered to it. So whatever you want to say about your characters.
Um, I think I don't plan anything ahead. I just see where it goes, and I
Mhm.
see intuitively feel out these characters, and sometimes they surprise me. Sometimes the things that they do are not what I had, like, because you kind of like have an idea of where the story is going to
Mhm.
go. and then you start writing it, and then they disagree with you. The characters do other things, and you're like, okay. They kind of take on a life of their own. So, I mean, from a psychology standpoint, because my degree's in psychology too, I'm sure there were some things that were being worked through in this story from both a past experiences of mine, and also just like you take little things that other people are going through in your life too, and kind of just it just all wraps up together in this neat little package that you didn't anticipate. Because I think that's what's hard for people to understand about fiction is like, yes, there's some truth base to it, but it can be as little or as big in so many different ways. Like you could see somebody at a coffee shop and be like, you know, I find that really interesting about them. I think I might add that little aspect of that person's personality or appearance or mannerism into this character. Or it may not even be conscious. You may just do it. And it's like, or like a friend is kind of going through this and you don't realize that you added it into your story, you know?
It's like those, I mean, that's like a perfect example of synchronicity, because the synchronicity is a meaningful coincidence. It's meaningful because there's something in the inner world that is showing up in the outer world, and it allows you to make this little connection. And so in that moment where you're like, because think about how many data points there are in a coffee shop. There's a million things you could have noticed, but yet you just noticed this particular thing. And I mean, I think you're just such a great example of being a willing partner to creative intelligence. So instead of trying to force and control, which is, which is my disorder, I have a hard time like just being open and surrendering. And I love it. Is there an example, without you sharing what you don't want to share, but you also, this is like teasing my listeners and viewers as well to read the book. But is there an example of like you're going on writing and you're writing about Tristan or Carissa or Robert or whatever, and all of a sudden you think you're writing this and they're like, no, we're going here. So like, can you share like maybe the scene was shaping up this way, but instead it went, like, is there an example you can share of how you're like, oh, I am not in control of writing this story?
I think there were several times that happened, mainly with Carissa as like character. This is her story. And there were several times where I thought she was going to do one thing and then she kind of pissed me off. And it's like, but we as humans do that too.
Right.
You know, you think we're going to do one thing and then in the moment we choose something else because that's how we're feeling or that's what we're drawn to. And I think the biggest concept that I'm trying, hopefully successfully, to relay here is a trauma bond. Because I think that's what underlies this connection that's ultimately kind of toxic for her, but she doesn't see it that way. And I think at the end of the story, you realize that, but maybe I'm giving too much away.
No, because that's really general what you just said. So I think what you just said is going to really intrigue people. So that's interesting because, it's like, why did that piss you off? So because sometimes we really like our inner desire is to do something, but then we have this voice that says, no, you can't do that because that's not following the rules, or you're not a good girl if you do that, or you're immoral if you do that, or you're being a bitch if you do that, or whatever. So when your character Carissa made a different choice, did it end up being like a challenging but empowering and liberating choice, or was it like,
yeah.
Oh,
she's going against what society or expectations would want from her to do. And so in those moments I was like, okay. I mean, sometimes I'd be mad about it, or she's like following her heart, and it's maybe like, you're from an outside perspective, you're like, no, that's the wrong choice. but it's like she can't help how she feels. So she's drawn to this. It's just that mind heart battle that happens. And from an outside perspective, or the creator, from the creator's perspective, I'm like, no, don't do that. That's not right for you. And she does it anyway because she can't help herself.
Oh my gosh. I love it because I felt like that so much of your book. I was like, oh my, but psychologically, we know that we're drawn to the same situation over and over again until we learn our lesson.
It's a repetitive cycle.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's really effective in your story. So, okay, thanks for sharing that. All right, so let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. Oh my gosh, I never sing in front of people, but I loved that song when it came out. Like I was there in real time. That's how old I am. So, anyway, okay. So what makes me sad when it comes to sex and women is, and everyone really, we're trying to escape these conventional ideas that are limiting and the repressive, and we know what happens when you repress. There's extremes. So yeah. And then the same with gender and relationship arrangement. So when I was coming of age in the 80s, women like me were feisty, claiming the right to have sex in the same way that men did. And it was liberating, but our desires were also counter. There was like such a severe backlash that seemed to like be rearing its ugly head again. And it came in the form of really of political movements that used religious righteousness, right? So it was a time for women, where we could be independent and could have careers, and we wanted to have partnerships with our husbands, but yet there was this backlash even from other women. So I remember my sister-in-law who had stopped teaching in order to start her family, and she found herself being frustrated with her fellow stay-at-home moms who were just demonizing like women like me who wanted to work too. And so, the divide and conquer strategy by, mostly the establishment, which is run by white male, grifters, worked well back then, and it's still working. And until we sort of men and women come together and support all of our choices and our experiences, it's just really damaging. So anyway, I did embrace my sexuality, but back then men were confused by it. So it's like if men initiated, they were used to that. And maybe they wanted women to initiate, but when women did initiate, it was like, well, wait a minute, though. I'm supposed to do that. And so it was like almost confusing for them. If I was like hypersexual, I felt rejected then. I ended up like sort of internalizing that as rejection. So there's just so much to talk about when it comes to that. So just share what you want about what you're trying to convey in your novel when it comes to sexuality and gender, career, independence, love, friendships, and systems, whatever, because you really do weave in sort of reality as the backdrop of your story. And it's real backdrop. It's not like old. It's really current. So whatever you want to share about, sex, gender, relationships, women and independence, men, wherever you want to go with that.
I just, I think Carissa's character is somebody that I want to empower women with regards to sexuality, because she goes after what she wants. She doesn't always know what that is, but
yeah.
She's not, and she kind of battles with it internally sometimes, still fighting those same standards. And it's unfortunate that society is still that way, because a lot of what she does in this novel would still be I've had people call my character a slut. I've had it, and it's like, if a man did the same thing, you wouldn't bat an eye about it.
What does that even mean anymore? Like, what that sounds so, man, so 80s.
It's like, yeah, she's probably a little hypersexual, and she's probably, but there's so many people that are.
Like, why do you care? And why do you care? Right.
And like, I feel like that says more about the person saying it and their projection than about the fictional character in my novel. And I've had reviews calling her a narcissist, a psychopath, saying she needs therapy, and it's like, is this a fictional character?
Well, you know what? Oh, this is really good, that range of insights. And it actually leads into my next question because when there is like a range of emotional responses from like, oh, it's liberating just for her to be honest. Like it really is an honest story, puts vulnerability out there. It shows how she's like has these inner demons and she's overcoming them. And yeah, she's going to go with what she's swept up in it because that's how we grow and that's how we transform. Even if we crash and burn, that's how we grow, right? So then you have, these other extreme negative responses. If you have that, what that means is that there's this tension then, and that what wants to happen is a reconciliation. And so, hopefully those people that, gave you those, said those nasty things actually read the book. If they did, that means the book is working on them.
Yeah.
And so I feel like what might be different, but maybe is not different, right? Because I see you share those things like, oh, somebody just said this about my book. And it's hard not to take it personally. But I do feel that there is this moment now where certain marginalized groups, including women, we could still say that, are realizing that when people respond to us in a negative way is because our power is threatening. And so we don't have to impose our power on other people. We just have to be okay showing our power. And that if we're being authentic, I love the spiritual saying, when we're being authentic and kind, right? Authentic and kind, and being us and having our own journey, that other people's responses to what we do is none of our business.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will say that most of my feedback has been overwhelmingly
Oh, I
positive.
bet. Absolutely.
And so those negative ones kind of stick to you, but in
Mhm.
a way, to me, it's just laughable. Like it's like, what?
Well, remember when you're challenging the status quo, there is certain people that are going to fight that. So the fact that you even get those, I mean, what would it mean if all you got was like, "Oh, this is such a nice story."
That'd be boring.
Well, you're not actually contributing to the growth of humanity. So
Right.
it's hard though, because it's like the more you have enough positive, liberating like reviews that you can put the negative in context and see it as, oh, I'm doing something. I'm like instigating something. So I love it. Because I wrote about 50 Shades of Grey, and it wasn't a book that I was like would ever read. It's just
Yeah.
what I'm a nonfiction reader. But I was curious because my sister, who would not be considered hypersexual at all, she read it and she said, I read it as a love story. And that got me intrigued. And then when the movie came out and there were these extreme reviews of liberation, but yet like, oh, that's abusive and just all this, I was like, what is really going on here? And it really, in the end, that story is not so much about like that lifestyle or arrangement as much as it's a reflection of the inner battle that we're having, between the masculine and the feminine, which are not about men and women. And so your book is sort of the same way that you're continuing to challenge convention and the status quo, and the fact that you get these reactions, I think is a good sign. So
I've
I think, oh, go ahead.
had women message me and tell me that my book literally changed their life
Well, there you
and
go.
that they feel so much more free to like have these conversations with their partner and to be more open-minded and to not feel ashamed for certain things that they, I guess, not necessarily fantasize about, or like just not feeling the shame of some of their internal desires, I guess.
Well, right, because if we don't like pull them out, we can't really find the deeper meaning in the desire or the fantasy. And I have this, oh, what's coming up for me is I had a client, a woman client, and she's a millennial, she's 30, and she and her husband, who had two little children, were ex-military. So they came from that sort of background, and they had two little kids. And so she was dealing with some self-esteem issues, and then all of a sudden one day she's like, can we talk about sex? And I'm like, Yes, that's my favorite thing to talk about in my sessions. And what ended up happening was when we get locked into what it's supposed to be, then we don't allow ourselves to explore. So
Right.
having a fantasy of something doesn't necessarily mean you literally want to do that. I used to have a fantasy of driving off the bridge, and it scared me because I thought, do I want to commit suicide? But once I found that the deeper meaning of the fantasy, because in my fantasy, I never crashed. It was like the space between where I could let go. And in my life at the time, I really needed that. So I, because of our conversation, I said, well, listen to my podcast episode with Dr. Julie Hamilton. She is a sexologist. And so your readers actually might dig her work. She is so feisty. And she's also has a PhD in depth psychology. And we had a great conversation. And that's where I learned about like polyamory. The root of it is many loves. It's not many sex partners. Now, could it manifest as in a sexual way? Yes. But not being able to actually be honest in your relationship about just, I have these urges, I have these desires, I don't know what they mean. And so if you don't talk to them, that's when they get, if you don't bring them up, that's when they get acted on in maybe a way that's dysfunctional. And so I love that you are having that impact on women, because even reading it, like it can make you uncomfortable. And if it's making you uncomfortable, there it's mirroring back something inside of you that wants to be explored. So that's fantastic.
Yeah. It's exciting. It just is like, oh, that's what I'm trying to do here. You
And
know?
you do, and I do, yeah, and I do really love how you just I say gently, you gently bring in the idea of polyamory. And I like the way that you bring it in gently. You just sort of work it in as a conversation of, huh, well, we could do this. Like, I think it's really effective, actually. So, okay, I'd love to talk about vulnerability, if that's okay. It's woven throughout your story, and not just Carissa's, but you really do bring in the vulnerability of the male characters. And you and my listeners and viewers are familiar probably by now with Brene Brown, author of many books and famous for her TED Talk, which was based on her 10 years of research about vulnerability. And in one of her books, she talks about her research focused on women, but she'd have these men come up to her and say, hey, what about us? What about our vulnerability? What about our shame? We have it too. And that really stayed with her. And then she shared this thing that's really true. And this is why we all have a gender and a patriarchy wound, is that women want to be partners with men. And they say that they want men to be able to be vulnerable and hold space for them to be vulnerable. But then when men do, we have to admit sometimes it makes us uncomfortable for our men to be vulnerable in front of us. So it's like we say it and then we're like, oh, that's making me cringe. Or for some women and some men, when men show vulnerability, they're like disgusted by it. That's really harmful to men. So I have a deep empathy and compassion for men too, because they've been sold a bill of goods and how they are supposed to be a man. And, you know, even within men, are you a real man? Or are you not a real? Like, it's ridiculous, this like constant ranking and comparison, which, of course, you know, that system of valuing the one-sided masculine, it's not that the masculine is bad, it's the one-sidedness of it. And the masculine wants to be a partner with the feminine energy. So, anyway, I like the way that you really work in, again, sort of gently. So you're not like, it's gently, it's just worked into the story, this idea of vulnerability. And I'm curious about, you know, your consciousness of that, or maybe it was those moments where you thought you were going to write this way and then it came out in a different way and you're like,
Oh,
so
I think that
whatever you want to say about vulnerability.
I think the vulnerability piece was a purposeful.
Okay.
I That's something that we're supremely lacking in society, and I view it as a strength.
Mm-hmm.
I think people are afraid to be vulnerable, and that's an issue, because how are we going to have genuine connections, genuine conversations, genuine anything if we can't be vulnerable? And yes, people use it against you. People view it as a weakness. But that doesn't mean you have to view it that way. I mean, I think that, like you said, Brene Brown, like she also considers vulnerability to be brave. It's brave to be vulnerable. you are opening yourself up to, whatever consequences may happen from that openness. And that's scary for a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people. But it's once you get past that fear, it's so joyful to just be like, this is me, all of me. Take it or leave it. Kind of like, here I am. I want to be seen. I want to be known. I want to be heard for exactly who I am and how I feel. And I want you to be okay with it. And when someone is, that's like so amazing. And I feel like too many people are missing out on that because of that fear.
Well, yeah, it's liberating. And Brene Brown talked about that courage is not being afraid. Courage is like, I'm terrified and
Yep.
I'm going to do it anyway. And it feels psychologically very risky.
Yeah.
But then you're right, like the sweetest experiences and glimpses of liberation can only come from that. And Carol Gilligan is another author who wrote a book called Why Patriarchy Persists. And she described it, based on her research, she described it as it's now a defense mechanism. The patriarchal wound, like, is a defense mechanism because we are now so separate and so scared and so defensive that it's too terrifying to actually have empathy and let somebody in, and too terrifying to be vulnerable enough. But yeah, evolutionarily speaking, to be vulnerable is the road to deep connection. So without the vulnerability, there is no deep connection. It's not possible, which is what you said. Like, deep connection comes from bearing your soul in some way. You don't have to do it to everybody, but like you said, to let out what wants to come out, as terrifying as that is. So I love it.
And I have to say that I've wanted to be, for example, I've wanted to be a writer my entire life. And I didn't do it. And I didn't do it. And I put it away and I set it aside and I pretended it didn't matter. I didn't need to it. And then one day I was just like, fuck it, I'm going to do it. And I was terrified. I was terrified to put myself out there in any way, shape, or form. But it felt like once I did it and I said, okay, it was like one step after another of the universe confirming this is what you're supposed to be doing. This is what you are always supposed to be doing. And because it was like kismet, just how like things just came together. And it's like, what if I never said fuck it? What if I would still be just like miserable inside because I wasn't following my passion in life.
Yeah.
And that fits in with that vulnerability. Like, writing or creating any type of art, you have to be vulnerable.
Well, yes, because the other reason you have to be vulnerable is that you are opening up to imagination, which is the unconscious, which is creative intelligence, and that's the unknown.
Yeah.
So there's like this unknown aspect to it. So if you think you create out of the mind, you don't. You create out of the unknown, and then your mind helps bring form to it. So that's the fluid nature of the masculine and the feminine. So I love that. I love that you share that. Yeah, and it is interesting that you will always know you're doing the right thing. There'll always be some kind of little reward
Yeah.
that just shows up, like it's affirmation. So you're like, oh, I was terrified. Is this still the right thing to do? I don't know. Done that with my business where I'm like, I don't know. I've had 2 bad weeks. Maybe I'm not supposed to do this. And then boom, a magical email shows up in my box that affirms and confirms that no, you're just having a hiccup. You need to keep on the path. So I love it. You're just at the beginning now. So your story is also, if we talk about relationships, a perfect illustration of a framework I developed to help my clients explore the deeper meaning of their relationships and their marriages and work relationships. And I call it the 3 Ps. And your story perfectly captures it. So especially projection. And you're very aware of projection. And that really works itself out in a way that makes perfect sense in your story between the characters. And because, of course, our attraction or annoyance or hatred or whatever, unless it's emotionally neutral, if there's an emotion, there's something being mirrored back to us that wants to be explored. It doesn't mean that we're like that person. Sometimes it's like a really exaggerated version of a trait that we're like, well, maybe I need to be a little more like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a negative trait, but maybe it's not negative. Maybe I've just been trained to think it's negative. So sometimes when we're like intrigued and also repulsed by the same person, that's what is going on there.
Yeah.
So like all of that is really woven into your story effectively. And then the first P though is purpose. So there's always a hidden unconscious agenda behind all of our, I mean, I got swept up in a crazy first divorce relationship that objectively speaking, I was Carissa making bad, like, why are you doing that? That doesn't make any sense. How is that going to work? And I just had to do it. So like you said, Carissa had to have these experiences. She had to be pushed so that she eventually gained the insight, the learning that she needed in order to see the world in a different way. So,
Yeah.
and then permanence. I think you kind of get at this too in your story. So when we cling to the notion that this relationship has to last, we wreck it up, man. We muck it up, man, because then we can't be honest. So if we're afraid something's going to go wrong in the relationship, then we're not honest.
Right.
But the paradox is if we're actually honest, and so you weave in like both these, you illustrate both of these things in your story, that when we are honest, we're actually more likely to have a deeper relationship. But the form of the relationship might change too. It might
Yeah.
not end up being a romantic relationship. It might end up being a friendship, but we're so attached to how it's supposed to be and our expectations that we miss out on the mystery of the relationship.
Yeah. And I think that's important. And I think this is also kind of where that question of like polyamory or monogamy, it's an intriguing concept. I think maybe it works for some people and for others it doesn't,
Mm-hmm.
and it depends. But I also think we shouldn't be so limited in our connections with people, and we
Mm-hmm.
should, like, it's okay to be like, I care about this person and I have love for this person, and it's okay to have that care and love and have it be, it doesn't, we don't have to define
Mm-hmm.
every and put it in these neat little boxes, like how the Greeks have so many different words for love. And there are, because you can have romantic love, friendship love, family type love, and that unconditional love, all for someone, and you can have bits and pieces of those same aspects for other people. And I think that we try too hard to be like, we can only have this kind of love for this kind of relationship, and I don't think that that's fair to humanity, because it goes against how we feel.
Yeah. And also, it's what a burden for the other person to carry. When you're like, oh, so you're my partner, and that means this. That means I'm supposed to get all my needs met through you. Well, that's a lot for that person to carry, right? And so it doesn't even make sense when you think about it that way. And I remember, and then the sexuality a part of it as well. So sometimes you will feel a kind of arousal that we also put in a box, right? And we think, oh, that means sex. But it doesn't. It's a kind of pleasure. And the pleasure is because I'm feeling a moment of joy. But we're trained to, sort of translate as, oh my God, I have to feel shame because that means I want to have sex with that person. No, how many of us like feel like aroused in a situation with someone else, and then we're like, oh my gosh, there's shame. How could I? You can't control like those emotions, right? And so I remember the first time this happened to me, I had a male colleague who we loved talking about social justice and economic development and all this stuff. And we were at a bar just catching up and networking. And I don't know what was going on, but all of a sudden I was like, so like aroused. And I had a little inner dialogue, which I don't know if you couldn't see it on my face. It happened so fast, but I was like, but am I attracted to this man? And then I imagine kissing him and I'm like, no, I'm not. But why am I aroused right now? And it was intellectual arousal.
Yeah.
It was like, oh my gosh, it's so exciting what we're talking about right now that I literally like felt that between my legs, right? And so, it's such a disservice, like you said, to humanity to not really have a framework where people can not constantly judge their own deepest desires, which sneak out from time to time. And because they're so sneaky, then we react to them in a negative way and then we repress those down. So that comes out in your story too.
Yeah. And I remember that from your book, that exact.
Oh,
So I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. But
I forgot that's in it. I'm still working on that draft.
that's, I think, that one of the biggest problems we have is that repression and that shame and this, and I think a lot of it does come from religion, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And it was something that's supposed to be like a good thing has really taken a turn and been a really harmful thing for a lot of people.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Lots of trauma from that. So this is great. What else do you want to share? What else is coming up for you? What do you want people to know about this particular story, which here it is, everyone. Of course, I'm going to put links in my everywhere and you'll be in my newsletter and we'll promote your book. And so what else, is there anything else you want people to know about this story and about you, and then, or whatever else you're working on and how people can find you and support you and all of that?
So this specific story is an adventure. It's an exploration of sorts. And I don't want people to be too like closed-minded about it. Like you said, it does start off pretty hot and heavy. And then it kind of evolves. And the story takes precedence over the spiciness. And it does have a lot of depth. And if you're not paying attention, you may miss it. So I think go into it with an open mind and just have fun with it, I guess, is my goal. There's less, yes. There's always going to be some deeper hidden meaning in everything I write. It's just the way it is. And then, the next one is more of a mystery suspense thriller, which is kind of but it still has like the romance subplot and some spicy, toned way down in that one. And then, so that's, if that's kind of your jam, that's a good one too. I think it'll also kind of touch on a lot of these kind of same concepts that we've in a different way.
Fantastic.
You can follow me on Twitter. That's kind of or X, I guess we're calling it now. It'll always be Twitter to me, but
right. And then do you have a website, an author website?
Yep. So I have a website specifically for my books right now. There's only the one on it, but booksbynatasha.com. It's pretty easy to find. I'm also on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. I think I planted a flag on Mastodon, but I don't do anything there.
Okay.
Beehive. Right. There's so many.
All right. I know. I just got going on Twitter and now I'm like, oh, now I'm on Threads too, but it's interesting. It's an adventure. So, yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Yeah, it is fun. And I'll see you on the platform. Thanks for a juicy conversation about romance and real life rebelliousness and the dismantling of stagnant conventional ideas and a growing awareness of the deeper purpose and meaning of relationships that we can't see when we're in it. And it's so easy for others to judge. Yeah. And we just have to do what we have to do. So, yeah. So thanks for being with me today.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Natasha Carter, author of the erotic romantic novel Unfinished Business. We touched on so many aspects of relationship, including sexuality and gender. I'll add all those links in the description box and also links to my other podcast episodes and blog posts about these topics. Until next time.